I get it, they're idiots, I better they fed him. We dare them, the police got wedding, is in a wedding is Southern Cross. Flame, we dead him. The police go wedding is in a wedding is in a wedding is flame, we dead him.
Philip Simpson does not merely have a defense. He possesses a catastrophic arsenal of evidence that mathematically destroys the state's entire narrative.
Love this land, my station brings handstand. Beauty a match, war, life has patched that. Fuck you, fuck the gov, corrupt the child, dove above. Cops, criminals, animals, sins, spins.
Welcome back to The Explainer. Today we're diving into part 3 of our series, taking a really close, objective look at a period of recent history that quite literally reshaped an entire nation. We're going to unpack the stark data, the official reports, and the intense personal accounts surrounding Australia's unprecedented pandemic policies, specifically looking at government overreach and the true costs of their zero-COVID strategy. Let's get right into it.
Looking at the sources we're reviewing today, we have to ask ourselves a pretty fundamental question. What actually happens when a government does absolutely everything possible to keep case numbers at zero? Like, what are the ripple effects when the total elimination of a virus becomes the single, all-consuming focus of a society?
To answer that, our explainer today is breaking things down into 5 key areas. We've got 1. The zero-COVID strategy, 2. Inside Howard Springs camp, 3. The massive economic toll, 4. The mental health crisis, and 5. Reckoning with the costs. Let's jump in.
Section 1. The Zero-COVID Strategy. Let's start by looking at the legal and strategic foundation of Australia's approach, an approach that the Victorian Ombudsman described as, quote, totally unprecedented. So this policy shift represents a massive change in scale. Think about it. Prior to 2020, pandemic management plans relied on voluntary, home-based isolation. But the Victorian Ombudsman reported that implementing these hard lockdowns on high-density public housing completely flipped the script. Literally overnight, we went from voluntary public health cooperation to strict government-mandated emergency detention. And as detailed in the Institute of Public Affairs report, this aggressive shift wasn't just a change in some policy paperwork. It required massive physical enforcement. We're talking a heavy police presence on the streets to enforce public health orders. This fundamentally altered the everyday dynamic between citizens and the state. Section 2. Inside Howard Springs camp. Now, to truly understand how this zero-COVID strategy played out on the ground, how it actually felt for the everyday citizens living under it, we need to look at the experience of a woman named Hallie Hodson. In an incredibly revealing interview with Unheard, Hallie described a genuinely terrifying sequence of events. Normal, uniformed police officers showed up, blocked her driveway, and threatened her with a massive $5,000 fine if she didn't comply. They then transported her in a designated COVID cab to the Howard Springs facility for 14 days of involuntary isolation, and here's the kicker, the most critical detail: she never even tested positive for the virus. Authorities just identified her as a close contact.
Her vivid description of life inside this 2,000-person camp paints an incredibly bleak picture of extreme isolation mandates. She described being dropped off by workers in full hazmat suits and just left there. Meals were delivered once a day, she faced constant surveillance, tall fences everywhere, and absolutely zero physical contact with the outside world.
The really crucial point here is why she was treated so differently than others who were allowed to just self-isolate at home. Hallie actually called the CDC from inside the camp to get answers. According to her interview, she found out her internment was highly likely being used as a punishment, basically because she initially lied to authorities about getting a test. Obviously, this raises some profound questions about legal rights during this era. I mean, we're talking about a 2-week incarceration handed down by health authorities without a trial or any standard legal due process.
While she was inside, she was restricted to a tiny 2-meter deck right outside her cabin. If she stepped off that little 2-meter space without a mask, that risked an immediate $5,000 fine or threats of even more time stuck in the camp. It really highlights the extreme, unprecedented level of microcontrol that authorities were willing and legally able to exert over individuals just to maintain that zero-COVID goal.
Section 3. The massive economic toll. Okay, let's zoom back out. We've seen the micro-level impact on personal liberties. Now let's look at the big picture, the macro-level financial fallout of these strict measures, which was extensively analyzed by the Institute of Public Affairs.
According to the IPA report, the net direct economic cost to Australia from March 2020 to June 2022 was a staggering $260 billion. That is a colossal contraction in economic activity directly tied to putting the economy into forced hibernation.
The report points out exactly where this financial damage was concentrated too. Victoria, which embraced the heaviest lockdown activity, responsible for 45% of lockdowns in Australia despite having only 26% of the population, suffered the absolute worst financial burns. Victoria alone lost over $111 billion. But keep in mind that $260 billion is just the direct economic loss. When you combine those direct losses with an unprecedented $562 billion in government spending, like the JobKeeper wage subsidies needed to just keep people afloat, plus projected surging inflation, the true combined fiscal price tag approaches $1 trillion, $938.4 billion to be exact.
Section 4. The mental health crisis. The sources make it abundantly clear. As the financial resources burned away, so too did the psychological well-being of the public. This wasn't just a monetary crisis, you guys. It was a deeply human one.
The reliance on police lines to enforce isolation, the constant threat of fines, the intense public messaging, it all fueled this immense societal anxiety that completely permeated the country. The Institute of Public Affairs notes that prohibiting social life compounded already existing issues of addiction, unemployment, and profound loneliness. To put some hard numbers to that feeling, Independent Schools Victoria highlighted a major study showing that 78% of surveyed Australians reported their mental health had deteriorated since the outbreak. The constant uncertainty, the intense isolation, the enforced idleness, it took a massive, measurable toll on the entire population. The collateral humanitarian damage outlined in these reports is honestly devastating. The lockdown-induced mental health crisis cost an estimated $1 billion in lost productivity alone. But far more concerning is the human cost. Surging anxiety in people who had absolutely no prior mental health history, and a horrifying statistic that 1 in 5 Victorian teens aged 14 to 17 experienced suicidal thoughts during the second lockdown. We also saw a drastic decline in community sports, severely fracturing the social fabric and safety nets that young people rely on so heavily.
And speaking of young people, the prolonged school closures caused massive educational setbacks. In Victoria, students missed more than 5 full terms of in-person schooling. Year 9 students fell behind by 12 weeks in reading and 17 weeks in numeracy. As the reports note, this places an enormous, uncounted future burden on a whole generation of students whose development was just put on pause.
Section 5. Reckoning with the costs. So having looked at all of this data from the sources, how do these cascading costs actually compare to the original stated goals of the zero-COVID lockdowns?
The Institute of Public Affairs report concludes with a deeply sobering metric. Looking purely at statistical life years, they calculated that the 1.8 million years of life lost due to joblessness alone was 31 times greater than the maximum possible benefits of all lockdowns throughout 2020 and 2021. And remember, that's just factoring in joblessness. That doesn't even touch the delayed medical treatments or the severe mental health crisis we were just talking about.
When we step back and look at the complete picture, on one side, we have the stated intent: prevent transmission, manage hospital capacity, save lives. But on the other side, as documented by these diverse sources, we see the very real aftermath of the zero-COVID approach: massive national debt, fractured communities, involuntary internment camps like Howard Springs, and millions of life years lost to socioeconomic and psychological ruin. The Institute of Public Affairs report argues this highlights a stark, painful contrast between a singular biological focus on a virus and the broader, vital requirements of human flourishing.
Which brings us to the end of this explainer and leaves us with one final, absolutely vital question to ponder. As the immediate panic of the pandemic fades into history, we really have to ask ourselves, when future crises arise, will society remember the devastating, multi-generational cost of prioritizing absolute control over basic civil liberties? What should the blueprint for the next crisis actually look like? Thanks for learning with us today.
In the middle of 2021, Australia's major cities looked like this. The government's approach to the pandemic had morphed. The original strategy of flattening the curve to keep hospitals from overflowing was replaced by an uncompromising zero-COVID regime enforced directly by the police. This chart shows the financial penalties issued by New South Wales Police during that period. Between July and September 2021, the numbers skyrocket, hitting $45.9 million in public health fines in just 3 months. The legal mechanism driving this was a 56-page public health order. It was heavily amended, often with only a day's notice, leaving the public struggling to understand what was actually legal. Because the directives were so complex and shifting, ordinary police discretion disappeared. Officers were handed strict compliance mandates, becoming blunt instruments of state enforcement. This framework moved the pandemic response out of clinics and into the streets, placing individual officers in a position to penalize behaviors that had never previously been illegal. On the ground, enforcement meant physical checkpoints. Police set up perimeters to stop residents, issuing massive financial penalties on the spot for minor subjective infractions. In Bankstown, a resident with a muscle-weakening disability went to a park to exercise. An officer accused them of loitering and handed them a $1,000 fine, ignoring the residents' explanations about their medical condition. In the Northern Territory, residents were approached at their homes. Police told them they had a choice: get in a transport vehicle bound for a quarantine facility or face an immediate $5,000 fine. Forcing a resident to choose between a quarantine camp and immediate financial ruin removes individual agency from the equation. These large, on-the-spot fines functioned as financial weapons. They bypassed the courts entirely, inflicting devastating monetary damage without any due process. Politicians frequently repeated the phrase that everyone was in this together. The data paints a very different picture. This heat map illustrates where penalties actually landed. Wealthy Sydney suburbs saw minimal enforcement, but extreme spikes hit socioeconomically disadvantaged areas in Western Sydney, like Blacktown, Mount Druitt, and Liverpool. The disparity extends to regional areas, with severe statistical spikes in populous Aboriginal communities, such as Walgett. In Victoria, this geographic targeting took a physical form. 3,000 residents of inner Melbourne public housing towers were suddenly placed under a hard lockdown. Hundreds of police officers deployed to form human barricades around the buildings. They prevented residents from leaving their homes, and the entire operation was enacted with absolutely no advance notice. The state detained these people without a plan. For days, residents were left without basic medical supplies, access to fresh air, or culturally appropriate food. The pursuit of an elimination strategy resulted in the state deploying its police force to isolate, hyperpolice, and trap its most vulnerable populations. During the hard lockdown at the Common Ground housing complex in Sydney, police intercepted and searched residents' personal deliveries. The Public Health Act contains no provision allowing police to search or confiscate the belongings of individuals forced into self-isolation. They overstepped their legal boundaries. Democratic rights were actively suppressed. When citizens organized a protest by staying inside their individual cars, hundreds of police, including the riot squad, swarmed the area and issued thousands of dollars in fines. Authorities even targeted the people meant to hold them accountable. Official legal observers monitoring police behavior were unlawfully ordered to move on and hit with massive fines just for being present. Suspending rights like public assembly and legal observation under the guise of an emergency reveals a deep institutional disregard for the rule of law. By late 2022, the financial wreckage was clear. More than $15 million in pandemic fines remained unpaid and outstanding. That outstanding debt acts as a permanent trap. It cripples the finances of individuals and families who were already experiencing severe economic disadvantage. Beyond the money, there is a profound damage to social cohesion. The heavy-handed enforcement fractured the trust between the police force and the communities they are supposed to serve. And these policing failures are only one piece of the puzzle. They sit alongside the massive economic debt, educational setbacks, and deteriorating mental health inflicted across the country by the lockdowns. A medical crisis requires medical care and community trust. Using law enforcement as the primary response mechanism left behind a legacy of debt and alienation, showing that extraordinary police power is a poor substitute for public health infrastructure.
Welcome back to The Explainer. So glad you're here because today we are diving right into part 2 of our series. We're going to take a really close, impartial look at exactly how Australian authorities enforce COVID-19 restrictions. And we're doing this by going straight to the data and the official reports. We're talking about the criminalization of everyday citizens, punitive policing, and the truly unprecedented fines that were handed out during this era. All right, here is our roadmap for today. We'll be hitting Section 1, the theater of policing, Section 2, criminalizing everyday citizens, Section 3, the massive fine machine, Section 4, targeting disadvantaged communities, and finally, Section 5, policing the right to protest. Let's get into it. Section 1, the theater of policing, establishing the approach. Now that striking phrase, the theater of policing, actually comes directly from the Victorian Ombudsman. This was in their official investigation into the hard lockdown of the 33 Alfred Street public housing tower in Melbourne. The report pointed out that authorities deployed this massive law enforcement response based on stereotypical security concerns. I mean, the Ombudsman specifically noted that the vast majority of these residents were just normal, law-abiding people. It really makes you wonder, as the report questioned, would they have ever used this kind of heavy-handed approach if there was an outbreak in a wealthy, luxury apartment block? And this right here perfectly illustrates that theater. Instead of a health-led response, the government literally deployed hundreds of uniformed police officers to entirely encircle a building of 400 people. Residents described the whole experience to investigators as absolutely horrifying. People were instantly confined to their homes, and many of them didn't even receive translated information explaining why they were detained until days later. It was just an overwhelming show of force. And, this intense, highly disciplined approach extended well beyond public housing, right into the quarantine system itself. If you look at the documentary by Unheard, they detailed the Howard Springs internment camp. This was a massive 2,000-capacity facility built for infected and even just suspected infected individuals. The inmates there were rigidly disciplined by officials. Just to give you an idea of how strict it was, in one instance, a resident was issued a formal warning simply for walking to a rubbish bin without a mask. And get this, they actually had a valid medical exemption, but it didn't matter. It was a complete zero-tolerance environment. Moving on to Section 2, criminalizing everyday citizens, the micro-impact. A really comprehensive report led by researchers at the University of New South Wales concluded that this whole strategy effectively turned standard everyday noncompliance into criminal behavior. Because the police force was positioned as the primary compliance agency rather than health workers, you had normal citizens doing totally normal things who suddenly found themselves facing severe state-sanctioned punishment. To really humanize this data, Amnesty International documented several of these interactions. One that really stands out is an incident where a person was just exercising in a park in Bankstown. Now, this individual has a disability that causes muscle weakness, so their exercise routine actually required them to stop and rest. An officer approached them, accused them of loitering, and hit them with a $1,000 fine. $1,000! The resident tried to explain their disability to the officer, but unfortunately, it made zero difference. And then there's this surprisingly absurd anecdote also from Amnesty's report. Police were managing a small, COVID-safe solidarity protest outside the Common Ground housing complex. There was a resident of the complex who was standing completely isolated on her very own balcony, minding her business. Police actually shouted up at her from the street level and gave her a formal direction to stop blowing bubbles. I mean, it really highlights the intense micromanagement of citizens' lives that was happening under the umbrella of public health. All right, Section 3, the massive fine machine, the primary tool of enforcement. $45.9 million. Just let that number sink in for a second. In just a tiny 3-month window between July and September of 2021, New South Wales Police imposed $45.9 million in financial penalties on residents for alleged breaches of public health orders. According to the UNSW report we mentioned earlier, that 3-month window alone accounted for more than 80% of the total value of all fines issued from the very beginning of the pandemic all the way up to September 2022. It was a massive operation. And as we look at some of the specifics here, it really highlights the jarring disconnect documented in these sources. What the reports describe as everyday, trivial actions resulted in these massive financial penalties. Sometimes these fines happen because police officers actually misunderstood their own complex and rapidly changing rules. Like, people were being fined for outdoor recreation in areas where it was completely legally permitted. Everyday people were being slapped with these $1,000 fines that fundamentally threatened their livelihoods, often just because of simple misunderstandings. Which brings us to Section 4, Targeting Disadvantaged Communities. Who bore the brunt? Because when you look at the data, the impact of these millions of dollars in fines wasn't felt equally across society. Both the UNSW report and ABC News data revealed a highly uneven distribution. The numbers clearly show that some of the state's most disadvantaged and minority communities were the ones targeted most heavily. In New South Wales, suburbs like Blacktown, Mount Druitt and Liverpool, along with Aboriginal communities in regional towns like Walgett and Brewarrina, they bore a massive, disproportionate brunt of this policing. Meanwhile, down in Victoria, data showed African and Middle Eastern communities were vastly overrepresented when it came to COVID-19 fines. The UNSW researchers, led by Professor Luke McNamara, stressed that this highly punitive approach caused immense lasting harm. Because look, fines aren't just a quick slap on the wrist for most people. They create a long-term debt legacy. In fact, over $15 million in unpaid fines were still lingering as outstanding debt by late 2022. And that debt continues to have terrible effects on people who are already experiencing socioeconomic disadvantage, which ultimately damages police-community relations for years to come. Finally, Section 5, Policing the Right to Protest, Suppressing Pushback. Amnesty International reported that because the public health orders basically omitted any specific provisions for safe protests, law enforcement ended up treating all protests as completely prohibited activities. Take August 1st, 2021, for example. A really tiny COVID-safe car convoy protest was organized. We're talking 9 people, all wearing masks, all staying inside their own vehicles. But they were met by an overwhelming force of over 200 police officers. They brought out the riot squad and mounted police on horseback. Those 9 individuals were hit with $9,000 in fines within minutes. And what's really fascinating here is the stark discrepancy Amnesty pointed out in the government's very own roadmap out of lockdown. At the exact same time commercial ticketed outdoor events were permitted to gather up to 500 people, human rights assemblies and protests were strictly capped at just 30 people. This glaring contrast raised some really serious questions about whether these restrictions were truly focused on protecting public health or if the pandemic was being utilized to suppress the right to peaceful assembly and expression. So, by looking closely at all this data, the sheer volume of fines and the official reports from organizations like Amnesty International and the Victorian Ombudsman were really left to ponder a profound dilemma. When a government relies on heavy-handed policing, massive financial penalties, and the suppression of civil liberties to enforce health mandates, does it actually protect the community? Or does it just fracture social cohesion and permanently damage trust? It's an absolutely crucial question to consider as we look back and evaluate this era. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. I really hope this helped unpack the reality of these policies on the ground. I'll see you in part 3.
Start with the early days of 2020. The original global mandate was simple: flatten the curve. We just needed to keep hospitals from overflowing. But in Australia, that goal rapidly morphed into something much more absolute: a strategy of zero COVID. Achieving a zero-case target relies entirely on total, simultaneous compliance from every citizen. To force that level of compliance, the state had to change its approach. A medical emergency was reclassified as a problem of law enforcement. This strategy prioritizes biological safety above the standard protections of movement and association, building an environment where the state can intervene in the private lives of its citizens at a moment's notice. On July 4, 2020, 3,000 residents across 9 public housing towers in Melbourne experienced this shift firsthand. They were instantly detained in a hard lockdown. They were given zero notice. Right across the street, their wealthier neighbors were given a full 8 hours to prepare for their own stay-at-home orders. But for the towers, the state deemed an immediate ambush necessary. According to the Victorian Ombudsman, the government deployed 500 police officers to secure the buildings. This massive show of force was based on false, stereotypical assumptions by the health department regarding public safety risks at the estates. The population in these buildings included a high proportion of non-European immigrants. Many were refugees who had fled dictatorships and survived torture. For them, waking up to find hundreds of uniformed officers surrounding their homes caused severe, immediate trauma. Inside, conditions deteriorated quickly. When residents were eventually allowed outside for fresh air, they found temporary fencing erected around designated areas. Residents likened these enclosures to prison exercise cages. The state's own watchdog eventually delivered a damning verdict. The ombudsman ruled that the immediate detention of these citizens was contrary to the law and a direct violation of their basic human right to humane treatment. Rather than learning from the mistakes in Melbourne, the tactics escalated the following year. When the Delta variant reached New South Wales in 2021, the government officially made police the primary enforcers of public health. The financial punishment was staggering. In just 3 months, New South Wales police issued $45.9 million in COVID-19 fines. Those fines weren't handed out evenly. The heaviest penalties landed on disadvantaged Aboriginal communities and low-income suburbs like Blacktown and Mount Druitt. Officers on the street were tasked with enforcing 56-page public health orders that changed by the day. The rules were so convoluted that the police themselves often misunderstood them, leading to arbitrary penalties. In one documented case from an Amnesty International report, a disabled person struggling with muscle weakness was stopped while trying to exercise in a park. Despite explaining their condition, police accused them of loitering and fined them $1,000. The dragnet kept widening. Authorities conducted illegal searches of personal deliveries at the Common Ground housing complex. Even small, heavily distanced protests, where people stayed entirely inside their cars with the windows rolled up, were suppressed with riot squads. The state had criminalized everyday existence. This failure was quantified later, when the government was forced to quietly cancel 33,000 penalty notices that were issued incorrectly. When you step back from the daily case counts, you have to ask a broader question. Was the suspension of civil liberties worth the total cost to society? The Institute of Public Affairs ran the numbers. Between direct economic losses, emergency government spending, and the resulting inflationary damage, the zero-COVID strategy cost the country $938.4 billion. But the human cost goes much deeper than dollars. Health economists track years of life lost. We know unemployment and forced isolation reduce life expectancy by driving up disease and suicide. The joblessness from the early 2020 lockdowns alone caused life years lost 31 times greater than the maximum benefits of every lockdown combined. That doesn't even account for the generational scars left on the youth. Prolonged school closures caused immense educational detriment, leaving some Year 9 students up to 17 weeks behind in basic numeracy skills. On a purely statistical, holistic level, zero COVID failed. It traded the long-term flourishing of millions for the short-term suppression of a single virus. The financial debts will eventually be paid, but the social cohesion may never recover. The heavy-handed enforcement permanently eroded trust between law enforcement and the marginalized communities they targeted. This is the intellectual trap of the zero metric. When a society becomes entirely obsessed with eliminating one specific threat, it goes blind to the humanitarian crises it creates in the process. The lockdowns are over, but the machinery built to enforce them remains intact. The legal and operational blueprint for stripping away basic civil liberties has now been tested, normalized, and logged for future use. The pandemic demonstrated a new operational reality. Under the right conditions, the mechanisms of a free society can be pivoted to enforce total submission.
Welcome to This Explainer. Today we're kicking off part 1 of a 3-part series digging into Australia's COVID-19 era policies and some really serious questions around government overreach. We're going to focus our lens squarely on the unprecedented events of July 4th, 2020. That was the date of the hard lockdown of Melbourne's public housing towers. Now, to understand exactly what happened, we're relying entirely on the rigorous official investigation published by the Victorian Ombudsman. We'll be looking objectively at how a public health crisis rapidly morphed into a massive police operation without warning, and why the official investigation ultimately concluded that fundamental human rights were breached. 3,000. Let that number just sink in for a second. On a single afternoon, approximately 3,000 residents living across 9 inner Melbourne public housing towers were detained by the state. And what makes this particular intervention stand out in the entire history of Western democratic responses to the pandemic is that these 3,000 people received absolutely zero advance notice. This became Australia's strictest COVID-19 lockdown, and the residents were immediately ordered to stay inside their often crowded, high-rise homes with absolutely no access to outside space. But before we start breaking down the systemic failures, it's absolutely vital to ground ourselves in the reality of the people who lived it. A community volunteer described it to investigators so simply, saying, "It was a moment of panic and chaos." Images of this intense distress quickly flashed on television screens all around the world. But how did this actually happen? Let's rewind the clock and see how this whole intervention unfolded. Section 1, an unprecedented lockdown. To really understand the government's response, we first have to recognize the genuine public health emergency that was facing Melbourne in early July 2020. Australia's second-largest city was literally teetering on the edge of a COVID-19 second wave. Health officials were deeply, deeply concerned about an outbreak linked to the specific network of high-density public housing towers. The official assessment at the time was that there was a huge risk of exponential spread. The government's goal was zero COVID transmission, and honestly, they were terrified of what might happen if the virus swept unchecked through these incredibly dense, vulnerable communities. The public health fear was real, and the clock was ticking. The absolute epicenter of this lockdown became 33 Alfred Street. This is a high-density public housing tower in North Melbourne made up of 152 residential apartments. Now, while restrictions on the other towers were eventually eased after about 5 days of intensive testing, authorities made the call to maintain a hard lockdown specifically at 33 Alfred Street because more than 10% of the residents there had tested positive. Because of that, over 400 people in this building were confined to their homes for a grueling 2 weeks. They were entirely unable to leave for work, for groceries, or for the most part, even to get fresh air. Section 2. Zero warning, maximum enforcement. So let's walk through the timeline for July 4th because it is fascinating. At 11 a.m., health officials actually agreed on an intervention that was supposed to start in 36 hours, giving everyone crucial time to prepare food and support. But then at 1:45 p.m., the Crisis Council met. Fast forward to 3:46 p.m., and the Deputy Chief Health Officer receives the legal directions while she's literally sitting in a car. And by 4:08 p.m., the Premier announces an immediate lockdown on live television. That 36-hour prep window, it just completely vanished. The Ombudsman uncovered something really startling about this. The Deputy Chief Health Officer, who, remember, legally signed the orders, told investigators that the immediate timing was not on her advice. She was given less than 15 minutes to consider these incredibly dense legal documents and their profound human rights implications before having to jump into a press conference. It appears the decision to drop the hammer immediately came from the cabinet, completely bypassing the specific timing advice of the actual health experts. And this right here perfectly illustrates the glaring inequity of how this intervention was applied. Throughout the entire pandemic, movement restrictions in Victoria had always been issued with at least some advance notice. In fact, on that very same day, neighbors living just across the street from these towers were given nearly 8 hours to prepare for their own stay-at-home orders. Yet, the residents of the public housing towers, they were given 0 hours of warning for an immediate, hard detention. The way this was enforced was equally shocking to the people living there. Instead of a health-led response with doctors and community workers, a massive Victoria police presence was immediately deployed. We're talking up to 500 police officers per shift surrounding the buildings, locking down access and restricting movement. The Ombudsman noted that this heavy enforcement model wasn't even based on direct advice from the chief health officer. For the residents, it essentially felt like a massive police ambush that completely shifted the atmosphere from a medical quarantine to a stringent, heavily armed police lockdown. To really grasp what that looked like from the inside, you have to hear from Aaron. He's a community worker living right there at 33 Alfred Street. Because there was zero direct communication from the government, he literally had to find out about his own detention by watching the evening news on TV. He told the Ombudsman, "When I saw the news, it said North Melbourne and Flemington, so I called everyone to tell them. The police came straight away." Section 3. Fenced in. The human cost. So what actually happens when you lock down 3,000 people instantly without using that planned 36-hour window to set up social and logistical support? Well, the first impact was deeply psychological. A significant proportion of the folks living in these towers come from culturally diverse backgrounds. The Ombudsman's report made a point to highlight that some of these residents had survived civil wars, dictatorships, and even torture at the hands of their former states before finding safety in Australia. For them, having their homes suddenly surrounded by hundreds of uniformed police officers was incredibly triggering. The government simply failed to factor in the specific trauma backgrounds of this community when they chose a police-first enforcement model. And that rushed timeline directly caused absolute administrative chaos. The Ombudsman found that physical copies of the actual detention directions weren't even handed to some households in English for up to 3 days. Crucial translated materials explaining what was happening in the residents' own languages, those were delayed by 5 to 6 days. And because authorities hadn't prepared a food or medical relief supply chain in advance, residents faced significant, scary delays in getting basic human necessities like formula and medication, relying largely on the heroic, immediate efforts of community volunteers to fill the void. Perhaps one of the most troubling incidents detailed in the entire report was the eventual Fresh Air program. After a full week stuck indoors, residents of 33 Alfred Street were finally allowed to go outside. But they were escorted by police into an outdoor area enclosed by temporary fencing. Residents told the Ombudsman they felt utterly humiliated, likening the space to a cage or prison exercise space. While health officials later claimed the fencing was a misunderstanding and eventually removed it, the Ombudsman plainly called the practice degrading and inhumane. Section 4. Breaching human rights. So, when you have a massive police presence, fenced enclosures, and zero warning, what does the law actually say? The Ombudsman determined that several fundamental human rights protected under Victoria's Charter of Human Rights and Responsibilities were severely limited by this lockdown. Obviously, this included the right to freedom of movement and the right to liberty. But critically, it also breached the right to humane treatment when deprived of liberty and rights relating to privacy and the family. Yes, public health emergencies do legally allow for some rights to be limited to protect human life. But the law is clear. Those limitations must be reasonable, justified, and the least restrictive means possible. Section 5. The Ombudsman's verdict. Let's look at how the Ombudsman weighed those public health needs against the civil liberties that were stripped away. The crucial takeaway is perfectly summarized in this verdict. The Ombudsman accepted that temporarily detaining the residents might very well have been medically appropriate to contain the outbreak. However, imposing those restrictions immediately without the planned preparation and without the direct advice of the chief health officer asking for an immediate start was not justified. Because there was a less restrictive option available, like simply waiting a day to prepare food and communication as originally planned, the immediate lockdown was deemed contrary to law and incompatible with human rights. To ensure this level of overreach could never happen again, the Ombudsman issued some major recommendations. First, she demanded the government apologize publicly to the detained residents for the immense harm and distress caused by the sheer suddenness of the lockdown. Second, she recommended amending the Public Health and Wellbeing Act so that anyone detained in the future has clear legal rights to review the decision, and most importantly, mandatory, meaningful access to fresh air and outdoor exercise no matter the emergency. The lockdown of the Melbourne public housing towers serves as a really stark lesson in the social and humanitarian costs of zero-COVID policies, an era where emergency powers expanded rapidly. The Ombudsman's report refocuses us on the undeniable truth that human rights are for all of us, no matter our postcode. And it leaves us with this vital question to ponder. If human rights are truly for all of us, how do we ensure they aren't the very first casualty in the next public health emergency? It's definitely something to think about as we continue our series on government overreach and public health. Thanks for joining me for this explainer. We'll see you in part 2.
You don't belong in the suburb, well tied to the lights. Uncool the anaconda, propaganda, funder, stunder, rise. Planting every revolution from the truth within the fucking seed. No greed. The federal, general, mineral police playing broad fraud, God rod, trod, sod of seats digging up the bog clog, yeah!
Skippity skip kern!
My passport,
8,
export resort,
6, Dresden! Let's fucking go! Let's fucking go!
The bureaucratic, atomic, energetic race. Minister, sinister, finister, toad in his gown, down, brown, frown, down mode. Try and drag the heavy levy load. How to kill a Ned Kelly with a bulletproof roof poof. Gang in the fight, keeping the island fire pile tire, right? Burning fucking bright. The national